The train came to a stop in Dry Creek amid red dust and relentless heat. The moment Eleanor Briggs stepped onto the platform, whispers spread like fire on dry grass. She was unlike any woman the town had ever seen. No soft lace dresses, no downcast, timid gaze. She wore a dark blue traveling coat, a book in hand, standing straight with eyes sharp enough to seem as though they could read every soul around her. In her pocket was a letter bearing the name Mason Thorne, a widowed ranch owner seeking a practical marriage. No love, no romance, only responsibility and duty. But the instant Eleanor saw Mason waiting at the far end of the platform, she understood that nothing would be as simple as the words on paper. He was distant, guarded, his eyes carrying more exhaustion than welcome. Their first conversation was brief and dry. Mason remarked that she was too educated. She didn't deny it. Silence followed them all the way to the ranch, where only an aging house and a stretch of barren land awaited. Eleanor hadn't come to Dry Creek to be loved. She came because she had nowhere else to go. Yet from the very moment her boots touched that platform, she knew one thing for certain. If she was going to begin again, she would do it on her own terms. The first night at the Thorne Ranch held no laughter and no welcome, only the weak glow of an oil lamp and a heavy silence between two strangers seated across from one another. At last, Mason made his expectations clear. He wanted a woman who knew how to stay in her place, tend the house, care for the livestock, ask no questions, and draw no attention. Eleanor listened without fear. She understood she had been summoned as a convenient solution, not as a person with thoughts and dreams. But she also knew her own worth. She had not left Boston to become a shadow behind a man burdened by wounds and pride. The next morning, she packed her belongings, not to run away but to walk forward on her own terms. She went straight into town, found the small clinic of Dr. Jasper Keene, and offered her help using the knowledge she possessed. That decision was more than a rejection of Mason, it was a declaration to all of Dry Creek. Eleanor would not live by the mold the town tried to impose. She would not bow her head just to be accepted. From that moment on, she was no longer the wife who was sent for. She became a woman who chose to write her own fate. Dry Creek's clinic was little more than a crooked wooden house, carrying the sharp smell of antiseptic mixed with dust. When Eleanor stepped inside and said she had been trained in anatomy, hygiene, and emergency care in Boston, Dr. Jasper Keene could hardly believe his ears. A woman with that level of education, in his mind, belonged in a crowded city, not in a windblown frontier town like this. But Eleanor hadn't come to recount her past. She rolled up her sleeves and went straight to work. She boiled bandages, reorganized the medicines, and properly treated wounds that had once been wrapped carelessly. When a drunken miner was carried in with a deep gash in his thigh and severe blood loss, it was her steady hands that saved him from infection. At first, the town watched her with suspicion. Some whispered that women had no business touching blood or blades. But results could not be denied. Patients survived. Children's fevers broke. Stubborn men began to nod in gratitude where words once failed. Eleanor didn't need to argue her worth. Every successful treatment was an answer in itself. Day by day, she was no longer a stranger who arrived by train. She began to take root, not through marriage, but through her skill and her unshakable resolve. The stranger first appeared in the general store, silent as a shadow. Tall, wrapped in a dark coat coated with road dust, a long scar running beneath one eye made his face even harder to read. He wasn't seeking attention, yet his presence tightened the air in the room. Eleanor noticed him only briefly, but she sensed something familiar in him, the kind of loneliness hidden behind a calm exterior. 2 nights later, he knocked on the clinic door. His shoulder was soaked with blood. "Bullet," he said curtly. No explanation, no plea. Eleanor let him in, as if she had been expecting that moment all along. She worked swiftly and precisely, the blade grazing skin as the oil lamp flickered. The bullet was removed without hesitation. He didn't cry out once, only his eyes darkened whenever pain surged through him. When it was over, she asked his name. He hesitated, then replied, "Just call me Calder." Rumors spread quickly through Dry Creek. Some claimed he had been a soldier, others whispered that he was a killer. Eleanor asked nothing more. She saw something different, a man carrying a past heavier than the gun at his side. They made no promises, no tender words. Just two people quietly recognizing in each other a shared understanding that needed no explanation. Mason Thorne was not a man accustomed to rejection. In Dry Creek, his words once carried weight. His gaze could silence a room. But ever since the day Eleanor stepped off the train and openly walked away from his ranch, things began to shift. Mason's silence was more dangerous than open threats. He didn't cause a scene at the clinic or confront her directly. Instead, he sat in the saloon, speaking in low tones with men whose eyes held bitterness. He planted the idea that Eleanor was a disruptor of order, a woman who didn't know her place. As her success grew, so did the fire in Mason's chest. People began turning to the clinic instead of coming to him when they needed help. Children learned their letters behind the church with her guidance. Gradually, the town started to look at her with respect, something Mason believed she did not deserve. To him, this was no longer about a failed marriage arrangement. It was a matter of pride, and the wounded pride of a man can become something very dangerous. Eleanor sensed the change in the air, the lingering stares, the sharper whispers. The storm had not yet broken, but dark clouds were gathering over Dry Creek. The town grew tense, like a rope pulled too tight. Conversations fell silent when Eleanor entered a room. At night, the laughter in the saloon lingered longer, heavier, laced with unspoken meaning. She knew Mason was not the kind of man who let humiliation slide, and even less the kind who accepted defeat. Late one night, after the clinic lights had gone out, there was a knock at the door. 2 short taps, one long. Eleanor opened it, lantern in hand, and found Calder standing there. His eyes were dark in the night. "They're gathering," he said quietly. "Mason's convinced a few men that he's taking back what belongs to him." She didn't ask how he knew. She saw the seriousness in his eyes, something that left no room for jokes. "Why are you telling me?" she asked. Calder looked into the firelight inside the room. "Because you won't run, and because I've seen what happens when no one gives a warning." Ager. There was a past buried in that sentence: loss, regret, a wound that couldn't be seen. Eleanor understood then that he wasn't standing with her out of obligation, but because he refused to repeat an old mistake. That night, they sat at the wooden table, planning what to do. No longer doctor and patient, no longer strangers. They were two people who knew that when the storm finally broke, the only way to stand was to stand together. They came at midday, when the sun stood overhead and the entire town lay under a harsh, blinding light. Hooves thundered down the dirt road like a warning of disaster. Mason rode at the front, his face twisted with rage, 5 armed men following close behind. Eleanor stood on the clinic porch, the gun in her hands steady and unshaking. Beside her, Calder quietly checked his ammunition, his gaze cold as steel. No one wasted words. They had prepared for this moment. Mason reined in his horse at the door. 10 seconds to leave town," he snarled. "This was never yours." Eleanor replied, her voice calm but carrying clearly through the tense air. The first shot rang out before the threat could fully fade. The street exploded into chaos, glass shattering, wood splintering, screams mixing with gunfire. Calder moved like a shadow, precise and relentless. Eleanor dropped to one knee behind a wooden post, firing with absolute focus. She was no longer someone who needed protection. As the distance closed, Mason charged straight at her. They crashed onto the steps in a violent collision. But before he could finish it, Calder was there. The struggle was brutal, dust and blood mingling beneath the burning sun. When the final gunshot echoed away, a heavy silence settled over Dry Creek. There were no more threats, no more chances to turn back. The dust slowly settled after the final gunshot. Mason lay motionless in the bullet-scarred road, while the men who had followed him were either thrown from their horses or scattered in flight. Silence smothered Dry Creek, heavy with the sense that something irreversible had just occurred. Calder stood in front of Eleanor, blood soaking through his shirt, his eyes still sharp and alert. When Mason made one last effort to rise, his hand brushing against the gun he hadn't yet dropped, Calder did not hesitate. A single, decisive shot ended it. No hatred, no second chances. One by one, townsfolk emerged from behind closed doors. They looked at Eleanor not with suspicion or contempt anymore, but with quiet acknowledgement. She was not a troublemaker. She was simply someone who had stood up when justice had been abandoned. The sheriff finally arrived, hat in hand, his gaze shifting away. He knew who had fired first, and he knew the truth didn't need to be twisted. No one spoke in protest. Inside the clinic, Eleanor stitched Calder's wound with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the very real cost they had just paid. Mason lost everything to pride. Eleanor, through courage alone, changed how Dry Creek understood strength, not through noise or dominance, but through action. After the gunfire echoed through the main street, many believed Eleanor would leave Dry Creek. She had fought, had nearly lost everything. No one would have blamed her for choosing a quieter place. But the next morning, she opened the clinic doors as she always had. She bandaged her own hand, reorganized the medicines, boiled water for sterilization. Everything moved with calm purpose, like a quiet declaration. She was not being driven away. People began to come more often, not out of curiosity, but out of trust. They brought bread, lumber, to repair the porch, and awkward, heartfelt thanks. The town seemed to understand that if Eleanor could remain after the storm, then they, too, could change. A new sign was hung at the door. Briggs Medical Office. Small, clear, solid. That name no longer belonged to a would-be bride. It belonged to a woman who had built her place with her own hands. Calder could have left as well. No one asked him to stay, but he didn't go. Each evening he stood on the porch, quietly watching the town learn how to breathe again. When Eleanor asked if he wanted to stay, he simply replied, "If you do." This time, she didn't turn away. She admitted she didn't want to be alone. They stayed not because they had no other choice, but because they chose each other, and chose this land as the place where their real beginning would take root. 5 years have passed since the gunshots echoed through the streets of Dry Creek. The town, once steeped in dust and fear, has changed. The school has been expanded. A green garden now grows where the old gallows once stood, and the main road no longer carries threats, only the laughter of children at play. Eleanor's clinic still glows with lamplight every evening. She trains apprentices now, passing on the knowledge she once carried from distant Boston. No one calls her the strange woman anymore. They speak her name with respect. Beside her, Calder is no longer a shadow weighed down by the past. He chose to stay. He chose to build rather than disappear. Behind their small house on the edge of town, a young pine tree planted years ago now stands tall and strong. Beneath its branches, their daughter runs barefoot through the grass, while their son swings a stick like a wooden sword. Life has replaced the sound of gunfire. Dry Creek is no longer a place that drives away those who are different. It has become a home for people who dared to stay and dared to change it. And Eleanor's story reminds us of this. Sometimes strength isn't found in leaving, but in standing your ground. If you believe in journeys of transformation like this one, share the story, leave a comment with your thoughts, and follow along for the next chapters to come.